She wasn't wrong about everything. That's the part of this story that never gets told, the part that makes what happened that afternoon at the San Francisco Martial Arts Festival more complicated and more interesting than a simple story about someone being proven wrong in front of 4,000 people. Diana Kwan had spent 22 years earning the right to say what she said that day. She had started training at 14 in a San Francisco gym that smelled of sweat and old canvas, had earned her black belt at 19, had competed regionally and nationally through her 20s at a time when a woman in a martial arts competition was still the kind of thing that made the men in the room uncomfortable in a way they dressed up as concern for her safety. She had built a school. She had produced students who competed and won. She had given 22 years of her life, serious years, disciplined years, to an art that she loved and that she believed deserved to be taken seriously. And then Bruce Lee had become famous. Not famous among practitioners. He had been known in those circles for years, and the knowledge had been complicated and respectful, and occasionally competitive in the way that knowledge about a genuinely exceptional peer is always complicated. Famous everywhere else. Famous in the way of magazine covers and film posters and conversations at dinner tables by people who had never set foot in a dojo and who now felt entitled to an opinion about martial arts because they had seen a man move on a movie screen. She had watched this happening from inside the community, and the things she had watched happening had bothered her in a way she had, over the previous 2 years, tried to articulate to other serious practitioners, with mixed results. The problem, as she understood it, was not Bruce Lee himself. The problem was the frame. The problem was what happened to a serious discipline when its most public face was a performance, when the version of it that millions of people were forming their understanding around was a version calibrated for cameras and choreography and the specific requirements of making violence look beautiful rather than the specific requirements of making it work. She had thought about this for 2 years. On a Saturday afternoon in October 1971, in front of 4,000 people at the San Francisco Martial Arts Festival, she decided to say it out loud. The festival was the largest gathering of its kind on the West Coast that year, 4,000 practitioners, students, and serious enthusiasts filling a sports arena for 2 days of demonstrations, seminars, and competitions. It was the kind of event that existed at the intersection of performance and practice, which gave it a particular energy, the energy of people who were simultaneously proud of their discipline and anxious about whether the outside world understood what the discipline actually was. Diana was scheduled as a featured speaker for the afternoon session. She had prepared a talk about the responsibilities of public representatives of martial arts, a nuanced, substantive topic that she had been thinking seriously about and that the festival organizers had been looking forward to. What she gave instead was something more immediate. She stood at the microphone, looked out at 4,000 faces, and said that she wanted to talk about authenticity. She said she wanted to talk about what happened when a discipline built on genuine, tested, proven physical capability became confused with the performance of that capability. She said, "He is a performer, an exceptional performer, but a performer is not a fighter, and a choreographed movement is not a technique, and until someone in this room is willing to say that out loud, we are all complicit in a misrepresentation of what we have spent our lives building." The arena made a sound. It was not a unified sound. 4,000 people simultaneously producing 4 different reactions, some nodding, the slow nod of practitioners who had felt this and hadn't said it, some uncomfortable, shifting in their seats with the look of people who agreed with part of what was being said and weren't sure about the rest, some angry, the immediate defensive anger of people who admired Bruce Lee and heard the speech as an attack rather than a question, and some simply watching, the way serious people watch when someone says something that could go several different ways and they want to see which way it goes. Diana pressed on. She was not a person who stopped when a room got uncomfortable. 22 years of being a woman in spaces that had not been designed for her had given her, among other things, a specific tolerance for discomfort that most people in that room had not developed. She said that the question wasn't personal. She said she had no doubt Bruce Lee was a gifted athlete. She said the question was whether the gap between cinematic martial arts and functional martial arts was being acknowledged honestly, or whether the community was allowing, even encouraging, a conflation that served commercial interests at the expense of the discipline's integrity. She said she was willing to be wrong about this. She said she was making the argument in good faith and inviting a good faith response. She was still speaking when a voice came from the back of the arena. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. The arena acoustics were good, and the voice carried clearly in the specific way of a voice that is not trying to project and doesn't need to because it already has the quality of something that fills space without effort. The voice said, "If you're willing to be wrong, I'm willing to show you." 4,000 people turned. In the 20th row of the eastern section, a young man was standing. He was not large. The people around him in the row were, several of them, considerably larger. He was lean, simply dressed, with the specific quality of stillness that is somehow more visible than movement. He had been in the audience for the entire session, sitting with his hands in his lap, listening. Nobody near him had recognized him until that moment, or if they had kept it to themselves, because the buzz that moved through the sections around him when he stood was the buzz of recognition spreading outward from a center, the specific noise of 20 people, and then 40, and then 200 people simultaneously processing the same information. Diana Kwan looked at him from the stage. The arena went quiet in the way that large arenas go quiet when something has shifted from the expected into something nobody planned for. Not the quiet of people being asked to be quiet, but the spontaneous quiet of 4,000 people simultaneously deciding that the best thing to do right now was pay very close attention. Diana was, by every account, a composed person under pressure. She had competed at national level. She had handled difficult rooms for 22 years. She looked at the young man in the 20th row, and her expression did not collapse into anything that could be called fear or retreat. But something changed in it. Because there is a specific moment in any argument, any real argument, conducted by real people who care about what they are arguing about, when the abstraction becomes concrete. When the thing you have been talking about is suddenly actually present. When the question you have framed as theoretical is looking at you from the 20th row and offering to become an answer. Diana Kwan had spent 2 years building an argument. The argument was about the difference between performance and reality, and the person she had been using as the primary example of performance was now standing in the eastern section of her arena and proposing, in 4 short words, to make the question real. She said into the microphone, with a composure that the people who were there still describe with a specific kind of respect, "Come down then." The 20 rows between Bruce Lee and the stage floor produced a silence different from any other silence in the previous hour. 4,000 people watching a young man make his way through a row of standing practitioners, down an aisle to the arena floor. Nobody sat down. Nobody spoke. The specific attention of a crowd that has understood that what it is watching is no longer a debate. On the stage, the festival organizer, a man named Robert Park, who had been running this event for 9 years, and who said afterward that he had never, in 9 years, felt as simultaneously excited and terrified as he did in the 90 seconds it took Bruce Lee to reach the floor, had moved slightly away from the microphone without making a conscious decision to do so. It was the instinct of someone understanding that their role in the next few minutes was to witness rather than manage. Bruce Lee reached the floor. He stood at the edge of the stage area, looking up at Diana Kwan. He said, "What would convince you?" 3 words, delivered in the same conversational tone as the 4 from the 20th row. Not a challenge, a genuine question. The question of someone who has understood clearly and immediately what the actual argument is about, not the public performance of it, but the real thing underneath, and is asking directly for the terms of resolution. Diana looked at him for a moment. She said, "Show me something I can't dismiss."
And here is the part of the story that gets lost in every retelling that focuses only on what happened next physically. Because what happened in the space between Diana saying those words and Bruce Lee responding to them was a conversation, brief, conducted mostly in the specific language of two serious practitioners looking at each other, that completely changed the register of what was about to happen. Because Diana was not asking to be defeated, she was asking to be shown something real. And Bruce Lee, looking at her from the edge of the stage, understood the difference in a way that everyone watching understood he understood, even before he moved. He said, "Then let's work." Not fight, work. The two of them spent the next 40 minutes on the floor of the San Francisco Martial Arts Festival, in front of 4,000 people, doing something that none of the 4,000 had come to see, and none of them left early to avoid seeing. They worked. Bruce Lee showed her things. She engaged them, tested them, found the places where her training intersected with his, and the places where the gap between them was real and genuine and worth looking at carefully. He asked her questions about how she taught certain entries, about the specific way her school developed defensive responsiveness, and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in what another serious practitioner knew that he didn't. There were moments when the 4,000 people held their breath. There were moments when they exhaled. There were moments when a ripple of sound moved through the stands that was not quite a cheer and not quite an ovation, the involuntary collective response of a large group of people simultaneously witnessing something that exceeded their expectations. At the 30-minute mark, Diana Kwan stopped. She stood in the middle of the floor, her breathing elevated but controlled, and she looked at Bruce Lee with an expression that the people closest to the floor described in the years afterwards as the most honest expression they had seen on a stage at any event they had attended. She said into a silence that the arena had produced on its own, "I was wrong about the performance." She paused. "I was not wrong about the question." Bruce Lee looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a single slow nod that contained more acknowledgement than most speeches contain. He said, "The question was worth asking." 4,000 people made a sound. It was not the roar of someone being defeated. It was not the celebratory noise of a crowd that has watched a villain proven wrong. It was something more complicated and more sustained, the sound of 4,000 practitioners who had come to a festival about their discipline and had witnessed, in the space of 40 minutes, the discipline itself being practiced at the highest level that most of them had ever seen, not in competition, but in conversation. Robert Park, still standing at the edge of the stage with his clipboard forgotten under his arm, said afterward that he had organized 9 festivals and had planned nothing of what had just happened and would have been incapable of planning it. He said the afternoon had produced something that he suspected nobody in the room would fully understand for years, a genuine exchange between two serious people that had started as a confrontation and ended as something that neither of them, when they walked in that morning, had known they were capable of having. Diana Kwan taught for another 30 years. She never publicly walked back the question she had asked that afternoon. She maintained, carefully and consistently, that the question about the gap between cinematic martial arts and functional practice was a legitimate one that the community continued to under-engage with. What she added, in the interviews she gave in the years that followed, was a clarification. She said that her error had not been the question. Her error had been using one person as a proxy for the question, when that person was, as she discovered in 40 minutes on a festival floor, the one person in the entire public conversation about martial arts who had thought about the question more carefully than she had. She said, "I came to challenge a performer. I found a philosopher who could also fight." Bruce Lee never spoke about the afternoon publicly. He didn't reference Diana Kwan in any interview. He didn't use the exchange as a story about having been challenged and having responded. The people who were close to him at the time said this was entirely expected. He had no interest in the narrative of having proved someone wrong, because that had never been what the afternoon was about. What it had been about, he said once to a student who had been at the festival and asked him about it privately, was a good question that deserved a real answer. He said, "She was asking whether what I do is real." He paused. That is the most important question anyone can ask about anything. He said she had asked it in the hardest way available, in public, with consequences attached, in front of 4,000 people who were listening for the answer. He said, "I respected that. You should always ask the hardest version of the question." 4,000 people had come expecting a demonstration. They got something better, the most important question in any discipline, asked at full volume by someone willing to be wrong, answered not with words, but with 40 minutes of two serious practitioners choosing truth over the performance of being right. If this story reminded you that the hardest questions deserve real answers, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about the man behind the legend, because Bruce Lee didn't silence Diana Kwan, he answered her, and the answer was worth every one of the 4,000 people who heard it.